history class with Dr. W. and our study of the year 1968. Over the past several lectures, I've provided some background to the events of 1968 by talking about the previous decades of the 50s and 60s leading up to our specific year. So we're now ready to begin talking about some of the events of 1968 itself, starting with one of the shocking events of January in that year, the Tet Offensive, which occurred in Vietnam. But like so many other things, we can't really understand what happened in the Tet Offensive without understanding a little bit more about the Vietnam conflict itself and some of the background of that event in the decades leading up to 1968. So forgive me, but we will turn back the clock once again. Over these next couple of lectures, we'll talk about the background of the Vietnam conflict, and then we will get to the Tet Offensive itself of January 1968. For those of you who might have taken my class on Vietnam or watched those lectures, or if you feel particularly confident in your knowledge about Vietnam, you might skim these background lectures to get to the Tet Offensive itself. Otherwise, bear with me for a few more minutes as we go over some of this background material before we get to January of 1968. What follows is not intended to be a comprehensive review of the history of Vietnam and of America's conflict there. Rather, it's intended to give you enough background understanding to understand what happens in January of 1968 with the Tet Offensive. So if you want to hear more about this background information, again, you can listen to my lectures on Vietnam itself or study in a number of other sources. But the most important thing to understand from this background information is that Vietnam, for almost its entire history, has been fighting off outside invaders, just like the United States in the 1950s and 60s. Going back to its earliest histories as a nation itself, almost 2,000 years, when it was overtaken by the Chinese. If you look at the map of Vietnam there, you see China looming to the north. Through most of its history, Vietnam was controlled by the Chinese. And yet also through most of its history, it fought the Chinese about that control and struggled for its independence. Eventually, in the age of imperialism, Vietnam and much of Southeast Asia became a French colony, a process that began in the 1600s and accelerated through the 1800s and into the 1900s, when France had established its most thorough control of Vietnam. And yet throughout that period, the Vietnamese struggled against the French just as they had fought against the Chinese for control of their own country. The Vietnamese never accepted French control, and they resisted it wherever they could. Under French rule, the conditions of average Vietnamese declined as their education system was dismantled in favor of forced labor, producing primarily rubber and coal for French needs. A handful of wealthy Vietnamese benefited under this system, but the vast majority suffered. In the early to mid-20th century, the Vietnamese launched a series of rebellions against the French. Most were small and local, and all were suppressed, but they indicated the growing dissatisfaction of the peasantry. In 1930, the Indo-Chinese Communist Party was organized by a Vietnamese patriot called Nguyen the Patriot, later called Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh was well-educated and well-traveled, having explored much of the world for about 30 years before returning to Vietnam in 1941. He even spent time in the United States and had petitioned the great powers after World War I to honor the principle of self-determination in Vietnam. A series of rebellions began in about 1930. As the French crushed these rebellions, thousands of other Vietnamese patriots were killed. Ho Chi Minh, who was still out of the country, was put on trial in absentia and sentenced to death. Most students of history recall that World War II began when Germany overran most of Europe in 1939. As part of that conquest, France itself, of course, was conquered. With France defeated, the most powerful nation in Asia, Japan, moved to conquer Indochina including Vietnam. France surrendered control of Vietnam to Japan in 1940, and it would remain so throughout the war. Revolutionaries in Vietnam began to see this as an opportunity. In May of 1941, Ho Chi Minh returned to Vietnam and with other communist leaders established the Vietnamese League for Independence, called the Viet Minh. The Viet Minh organized at the village level, and peasants, workers, students, intellectuals, women, and old and young were invited. In other words, there was no way to distinguish just from looking at someone whether they might be involved in this organization. It's also somewhat ironic that the United States and Vietnam were allies for a time, united in their war against Japan. United States troops first entered Vietnam during World War II to launch attacks against the Japanese. The Viet Minh saw another opportunity for possible independence in mid-1945. The Japanese, growing desperate as World War II drew to a close, launched attacks into Vietnam to eradicate the remaining French influence. With French authorities largely removed, the Japanese then surrendered to the United States after the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Viet Minh called for a national revolution and seized control of local governments throughout the country. On August 29th, the Viet Minh formed a provisional government with its capital in Hanoi. This is known as the August Revolution. For a brief moment, Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh gained control of their own country, seizing its independence. This independence was not to endure. Harry Truman, assuming the presidency in the last months of the war and in the peace after, was concerned at having a weakened France in the post-war world, which was rapidly descending into the Cold War. Truman, not concerned with Vietnamese history or interests, was more interested in having a powerful and solvent France. So the United States did not honor Vietnamese independence, instead supporting the restoration of French rule. The French, weakened after World War II, found it impossible to hold on to its former colonies, including Vietnam. The Viet Minh launched a rebellion against the French. Early in this war, Ho Chi Minh said, "It will be a war between an elephant and a tiger. If the tiger ever stands still, the elephant will crush him with his mighty tusks. But the tiger will not stand still. He will leap upon the back of the elephant, tearing huge chunks from his side, and then he will leap back into the dark jungle. And slowly, the elephant will bleed to death. That will be the war in Indochina." And he was right. The French had many victories early in the war, but they struggled to retain true support. They failed to provide a realistic alternative to Ho Chi Minh and the Communists, and they refused to grant any Vietnamese government real sovereignty. And, again, weakened after their defeat in World War II, they really didn't have the global strength to maintain control in Vietnam without assistance. And that is where the United States began to enter the picture. This, of course, is under President Dwight Eisenhower. Eisenhower and other leaders in the United States, especially Secretary of State Dean Acheson, were determined to stop the spread of communism. Remember, in a previous lecture, I talked about the idea of containment in the aftermath of World War II. While the Soviet Union, so far, was not involved at all in the Vietnamese affair, United States leaders simply could not accept an independent Vietnam with communist leanings. So in the late 1940s, they began offering aid to the French in their effort to retain control. This is also the era when the so-called domino theory began to take hold. And again, I talked about the domino theory in a previous lecture. The idea being that if a country like Vietnam fell to communism, so would Laos, so would Cambodia, then Thailand, Burma, Japan, the Philippines, and elsewhere. It's important to note that China had already fallen to communism in 1949, and thus American leaders felt they had to hold the line in places like Korea and Vietnam. And the Korean War begins in 1950 and is another important element of the background of this. American intelligence indicated that without American assistance, France was in danger of being defeated by the Viet Minh. So they stepped up assistance. Unfortunately for the United States, this was the beginning of a long losing effort. The war was already unpopular in France, and calls had come to abandon the war. Under the Truman administration, the United States sent military advisors, weapons, and aid totaling about $1 billion to Vietnam. In January 1951, the Vietnamese launched a major offensive against French installations. Ultimately, the French managed to beat back those attacks and inflicted serious casualties. But by 1952 and 53, the Viet Minh were taking larger and larger chunks of territory. Their armies were growing stronger all the time. They had a clear nationalist mission. The French, even with American support, found it harder and harder to hold off the Viet Minh. And again, they offered no clear alternative. Even their allies didn't know what they were fighting for. In early 1954, the French were growing weary and approached Ho Chi Minh about peace talks. At the same time, a major French army group was surrounded at a village called Dien Bien Phu. The attack was planned carefully for months. Some 100,000 soldiers and 200,000 or more workers surrounded the French encampment of about 12,000 men. On March 13, 1954, the Viet Minh began their attack. Bombarding airfields and supply lines, they cut off the French force, and on May 7th, they overran the French encampment. It was the decisive battle in the Long War, and led directly to the Geneva Peace Conference. The French had been resoundingly defeated. By this time, the United States had begun to realize they had to move on from the prospect of supporting the French in Vietnam. They hoped to back some anti-nationalist, non-communist regime in Vietnam, and clearly Ho Chi Minh was not the choice. The great Cold War powers dominated the Geneva Conference. The Soviet Union and China, while supportive of Ho, encouraged him to yield somewhat to the French to avoid a major conflict again with France and the United States. The Geneva Accords, coming out of that 1954 conference, called for a temporary division of Vietnam at the 17th parallel. North and South Vietnam were thus created. And they called for, in 2 years, a national election that would reunify the country. They also declared a ceasefire in the conflict. The Eisenhower administration now made the fateful decision to replace the French in South Vietnam. Still determined to stop communism, the United States had 2 years to create a viable alternative to defeat Ho Chi Minh in the promised elections of 1956. The French War played out much like the American War that was to come. They were not successful in offering an alternative to the communist government. They didn't understand Vietnamese culture, and ultimately they lost the support of their own people in waging the war. Following the Geneva Accords, chaos set in Vietnam. First, there was a battle in South Vietnam for control of the government and the support of the Americans. Ultimately, the Americans supported Vo Dinh Diem, who prevailed in this struggle. Diem was a Catholic and nationalist and anti-French, all of which appealed to the United States. But he had great difficulty unifying a diverse population, many of which supported the Viet Minh and Ho Chi Minh. While Diem established control in the South, with much American support, it was clear by 1956 that he would not win an election against Ho Chi Minh. So Diem decided not to abide by the Geneva Accords and allow the election, and the United States didn't challenge him. Instead, Diem held a mock election in the South, which was fraught with corruption, and secured a victory with 98% of the vote. Diem became harshly repressive of any groups opposed to him. He was also unpopular for appointing mostly friends and family to positions of importance. There was no democracy here. Diem waged fierce battles against the Viet Minh, and the South Vietnamese army patrolled the countryside, searching out opposition. Many were executed during this period. In 1960, the North Vietnamese created the National Liberation Front, called the Viet Cong by Diem. The Viet Cong recruited supporters of Ho Chi Minh, mostly in the countryside, and launched attacks against Diem in the south. In the United States, John F. Kennedy became president in 1961 after winning the election of 1960, and I've already talked a little bit previously about his presidency. Under Kennedy, American policy in Vietnam was counterinsurgency. We sent American special forces to train the South Vietnamese to create their own special forces, then run missions seeking out the Viet Cong. Under Kennedy, we tried to win the war with a few advisors, many weapons, and a positive attitude. Kennedy increased the number of military advisors in Vietnam. He was a more modern thinker, perhaps, than Eisenhower. He was concerned about Diem and his policies in the South. But how could he deal with Diem in Vietnam? The Kennedy policy came to be known as flexible response, responding in kind to the enemy's methods. And so, John F. Kennedy pushed counterinsurgency in South Vietnam. Unfortunately, the Americans came to learn that flexible response doesn't really work, and particularly didn't work in Vietnam. The problem is, as you're responding in kind to the actions of the enemy, you're always reacting, and you allow the enemy to determine how far things are going to go. In the case of Vietnam, this allowed things to escalate seemingly endlessly, and before long, the United States came to be involved in a full-scale war. Kennedy ultimately increased the number of military advisors in South Vietnam from 900 to about 16,700 by the end of his presidency. His strongest policy in Vietnam, and greatest failure, was known as the Strategic Hamlet Program. It called for moving entire villages to isolate them from the Viet Cong. The idea being that the Viet Cong wouldn't be able to find and recruit new members if it kept them away from the rest of society. This ultimately was a disastrous policy. Vietnamese culture is very much tied to the land. They viewed the ground as sacred, particularly in their villages where their ancestors had been buried for thousands of years. They hated to move. Conditions in the strategic hamlets were also terrible. They were basically prisoners in these heavily fortified villages. And just keep in mind, again, these are our allies who are being placed into the hamlets. They also made easy targets for Viet Cong attacks and also for Viet Cong recruitment. Eventually, many of the hamlets were torn down by their own residents, and many of them rushed to join the Viet Cong once they were freed. In late 1963, things were reaching a boiling point. By the end of 1963, the Diem government had become a real problem. Buddhist priests were burning themselves in the streets. Diem was falling from favor, and there were rumors of an attempted coup and overthrow. The CIA knew much information about this, and Kennedy did as well. On November 1st, there was a coup versus Diem, and he fell. Diem and his brothers were murdered. Soon after, John F. Kennedy was assassinated. It was time for a change in American policy. We'll talk more about that in the next lecture.